The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with its usual chaos of Saturday night trauma cases. Dr. Marcus Webb, a former Navy SEAL turned trauma surgeon, moved through the controlled mayhem with practiced precision. His military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, a skill that served him well in civilian medicine. As he finished suturing a motorcycle accident victim, a nurse approached with urgency written across her face. "Dr. Webb, we have an incoming GSW to the abdomen. How to 3 minutes?" Marcus nodded, already mentally preparing for the next case as he stripped off his gloves and headed toward the trauma bay. The ambulance doors burst open, and paramedics rushed in a stretcher carrying a young woman who appeared to be in her late 20s. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandages on her torso, but what struck Marcus immediately wasn't the wound itself. It was how she lay perfectly still, her breathing controlled despite obvious pain, her eyes scanning the ceiling in a methodical pattern he recognized all too well. "What's her status?" Marcus asked as they transferred her to the trauma bed. The paramedic rattled off vitals and explained they'd found her in an alley downtown, conscious and alert, refusing pain medication until they could guarantee it wouldn't interfere with her ability to think clearly. Most gunshot victims would be screaming or at least moaning, but this woman remained eerily silent. As Marcus began his initial assessment, he noticed several things that made him pause. Her hands, despite the trauma, showed calluses in very specific patterns on her palms and knuckles. A faded tan line on her ring finger suggested she'd recently removed a wedding band, but it was the small scar just above her left eyebrow that made his breath catch. He'd seen that exact type of mark before, usually from shrapnel or training accidents. "Ma'am, I'm Dr. Webb. Can you tell me your name?" he asked while examining the gunshot wound. Her eyes met his for the first time, and in that brief moment he saw something that confirmed his growing suspicion. These weren't the eyes of a random crime victim. They held the same 1,000-yard stare he'd seen in mirrors during his own deployment years. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice steady despite her condition. "Sarah Mitchell." She paused, studying his face with the same intensity he was studying hers. "Former Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, if that matters to you, Doctor." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd suspected from her bearing and reactions that she might have military experience, but hearing her rank confirmed what he'd hoped wasn't true. This wasn't just another trauma case walking through his doors. This was a fellow warrior who'd somehow ended up bleeding on his table in the middle of the night. "It matters," he said quietly, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "Marines?" he asked, though something told him he was wrong even as the word left his mouth. Sarah's lips curved into what might have been a smile if the situation weren't so dire. "Army Special Forces," she corrected. "Medic. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan before." She trailed off, her jaw tightening against pain that Marcus suspected wasn't entirely physical. The way she said "before" carried weight, suggesting her military career had ended under circumstances she wasn't ready to discuss. Marcus felt the familiar weight of recognition settle in his chest. He'd treated enough combat veterans to know that the wounds you couldn't see often hurt worse than the ones that bled. As he worked to stabilize her condition, he found himself wondering what had brought a decorated Special Forces medic to a back alley in downtown Chicago with a bullet in her gut. "The wound is through and through," he explained as he worked. "Missed the major organs, but you're going to need surgery to clean it up properly." Sarah nodded, unsurprised by the assessment. Her medical training would have told her the same thing the moment she'd felt the bullet's path. "Doctor," she said, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength, "I need you to know this wasn't random. And I need you to know that when they ask questions, I was alone tonight. Completely alone. Can you understand that?" Her eyes bored into his with an intensity that made it clear this wasn't a request born from shock or confusion. Marcus studied her face, seeing layers of meaning in her words that civilians wouldn't catch. In their world, being alone could mean the difference between protecting others and putting them in danger. "I understand," he said simply, and meant it. As they prepared to move her to surgery, Sarah's grip on his wrist tightened once more. "Webb," she said, having clearly read his name tag. "Navy." When he nodded, she managed that almost smile again. "Figures." Only a SEAL would recognize the signs that fast. Despite everything, there was respect in her voice, the kind that only existed between people who'd walked similar paths through hell and somehow made it back. The surgery went smoother than Marcus had expected. Sarah's physical condition suggested someone who'd maintained their military fitness standards even after leaving service, which worked in her favor during the procedure. As he worked to repair the damage, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to her story than a random street crime. 3 hours later, Sarah woke up in recovery with the same controlled awareness she'd shown in the emergency room. Marcus was reviewing her chart when her eyes opened, immediately scanning the room for exits and potential threats before settling on him. Old habits from the battlefield died hard. "How long was I out?" she asked, her voice clearer now that the immediate trauma had been addressed. Marcus noticed she didn't ask about pain levels or when she could go home, the typical first questions from civilian patients. 3 hours for surgery, another 2 in recovery. "It's almost dawn," Marcus replied, pulling up a chair beside her bed. Something about her demeanor told him this conversation would be important. "The bullet did minimal damage. You'll be sore for a few weeks, but you should make a full recovery." Sarah nodded, processing the information with clinical detachment. "The police?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew they'd been asking questions. "Waiting to talk to you. I told them you needed at least another hour before you'd be coherent enough for an interview." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's story doesn't add up. Random muggings don't usually result in single, through-and-through gunshot wounds to the abdomen. That's either extremely lucky or extremely precise." Sarah's eyes sharpened, studying his face for signs of judgment or suspicion. What she saw instead was professional concern mixed with something she hadn't expected: understanding. "You really were Navy," she said, not making it a question. "How long?" 8 years active duty, 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan. Got out in 2018 and went to medical school." Marcus kept his voice neutral, but Sarah caught the slight tension when he mentioned getting out. Like her, his military career had probably ended with complications. "And now you're asking questions that could get complicated answers," Sarah observed. "Are you sure you want to go down that road, Doctor?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. In the military, you learn to recognize when someone was carrying operational secrets, the kind that could endanger lives if spoken aloud. But you also learn to recognize when a fellow service member was in trouble and trying to handle it alone. "Off the record?" he asked finally. Sarah nodded slowly. "I've seen enough combat vets come through these doors to know the difference between someone running from their past and someone still fighting their war." "Which one are you?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, Marcus saw a flicker of the vulnerability she'd been hiding behind her military composure. "Both," she admitted quietly. "I got out 18 months ago. Medical discharge after an IED took out most of my unit outside Kandahar. Survivor's guilt, PTSD, the whole package. The Army gave me a Purple Heart and a medical pension, then sent me back to a world that didn't know what to do with me." Marcus felt the familiar ache of recognition. He'd seen too many good soldiers broken by the transition from military to civilian life, especially those who'd lost their teams. "And last night?" Sarah hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "I've been working private security. Nothing glamorous, mostly corporate stuff, but sometimes the past catches up with you in ways you don't expect." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "Let's just say some people I served with made different choices about how to use their skills after getting out. Not all of them were good choices." The implications of her words settled over Marcus like a cold weight. Private military contractors, mercenary work, organized crime. There were dozen ways former Special Forces soldiers could end up on the wrong side of the law, especially when they came home broken and the system failed them. "Are you in immediate danger?" he asked, his medical training warring with his protective instincts. Sarah's silence was answer enough. "Do you have anywhere safe to go when you leave here?" "I've been handling myself for a long time, Doc, but I appreciate the concern." Sarah tried to shift position and winced at the pull of her sutures. "The thing is, I didn't just stumble into that alley by accident. I was meeting someone, trying to extract myself from a situation that's been developing for months. It didn't go as planned." Marcus absorbed this information, understanding now why she'd been so insistent about being alone. If she was involved in something that had put her in danger, anyone associated with her could become a target. "The person you were meeting, are they okay?" Sarah's expression darkened. "That's complicated, and probably not something you want to know the details about." She studied his face carefully. Look, I know we just met, but you strike me as someone who understands that sometimes good people end up in bad situations through no fault of their own. That's where I am right now. Before Marcus could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. A police detective stepped in, notepad in hand and questions in his eyes. Sarah's demeanor immediately shifted back to the controlled professional mask she'd worn in the emergency room. Ms. Mitchell, I'm Detective Rodriguez. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened last night. Detective Rodriguez was a veteran cop with 20 years on the force, and he'd learned to read people the way Marcus read x-rays. As he settled into the chair across from Sarah's hospital bed, his experienced eyes took in details that most people would miss. The way she positioned herself to see the door, the controlled breathing, the alert stillness that spoke of combat training. Ms. Mitchell, can you tell me what you remember about last night? Rodriguez asked, his pen poised over his notepad. His tone was professional but not unkind. He'd interviewed enough trauma victims to know that pushing too hard too fast often yielded nothing useful. Sarah's response was textbook perfect, delivered with the precision of someone who'd been trained in operational security. I was walking home from dinner around 11:30. I'd parked about 3 blocks away because the restaurant area was crowded. As I was cutting through the alley near 5th Street, someone approached me from behind. Did you see the attacker? Rodriguez asked, making notes. Not clearly. Average height, dark clothing, possibly male based on build. It happened very quickly. Sarah's voice remained steady, giving away nothing about the fact that she'd known exactly who was waiting for her in that alley and why. Marcus watched the exchange with growing unease. He could see Rodriguez wasn't entirely buying the random mugging story either, but without evidence to the contrary, there wasn't much the detective could do except take her statement and file it with a dozen other unsolved street crimes from that week. Was anything taken? Rodriguez continued. Purse, wallet, jewelry? My purse. It had about $60 cash and my credit cards. I already called to cancel them. Sarah had clearly thought through her story carefully. The details were plausible enough to satisfy a routine police investigation. Rodriguez made more notes, but Marcus could see the detective's frustration. Experienced cops developed instincts about when victims weren't telling the whole truth, but they also knew when to push and when to let things lie. Ms. Mitchell, is there anything else you think might be relevant? Anyone who might have reason to target you specifically? The question hung in the air for several seconds before Sarah shook her head. No, detective. I live a pretty quiet life. This was just wrong place, wrong time. The lie came so smoothly that Marcus almost believed it himself. After Rodriguez left with promises to follow up if any leads developed, Sarah and Marcus sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Marcus spoke up. You know he didn't believe you, right? Of course he didn't, but believing and proving are two different things. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her bed. Look, I know this puts you in an awkward position. You're mandatory reporters for certain things, and lying to police probably falls into a gray area you'd rather not navigate. Marcus considered his response carefully. His medical oath required him to do no harm, but it didn't specify whether that meant avoiding harm to his patient or avoiding harm to potential future victims. Sarah, I need to ask you directly. Is anyone else going to get hurt because of whatever happened last night? The question seemed to hit Sarah harder than he'd expected. Her composed facade cracked slightly, revealing exhaustion and something that looked like grief. God, I hope not. But honestly, I don't know anymore. What does that mean? Sarah was quiet for so long, Marcus thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions that had gone horribly wrong. Remember I mentioned that some people I served with made different choices after getting out? One of them contacted me 6 months ago, said he had information about what really happened to our unit in Afghanistan, information that certain people didn't want to come to light. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Military cover-ups, classified information, whistleblowing, all roads that led to very dangerous places. What kind of information? The kind that could ruin careers and political aspirations, maybe even result in criminal charges for people currently wearing stars on their shoulders. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, the kind that gets people killed for knowing about it. The implications were staggering. Marcus had heard rumors during his own service about operations that went sideways and were subsequently buried in classified reports that would never see daylight. He'd always assumed they were just rumors, The kind of conspiracy theories that flourished in military communities. And last night, he prompted, was supposed to be a handoff. My contact had evidence. Documents, recordings, something concrete. He wanted to give it to someone he trusted to get it to the right people. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, but when I got there, it was clear someone else had gotten to him first. Is he alive? Sarah's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the full scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just about Sarah being in danger. She was potentially carrying information that people had already killed to suppress. Sarah, you need to go to the FBI, the CIA, someone with the authority to handle this kind of situation. With what evidence? Everything was supposed to be in a briefcase that wasn't there when I arrived. For all I know, whoever killed him has already destroyed everything. Sarah's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd seen too many good intentions end in failure. Besides, how do I know who to trust? If this goes as high as my contact believed, there could be people in those agencies who are already compromised. Marcus realized with growing alarm that Sarah wasn't just a trauma victim, or even a veteran in trouble. She was potentially a witness to murder, carrying knowledge that powerful people wanted buried with nowhere safe to turn. The gunshot wound in her abdomen wasn't random violence, and it was attempted assassination. They tried to kill you, he said, the words carrying the weight of certainty. Yes, Sarah confirmed simply, and they'll try again if they figure out I survived. The only reason I got out of that alley alive is because I saw the muzzle flash and moved before the shot hit center mass. Military training saved my life, but it won't keep saving it indefinitely. The weight of Sarah's revelation settled over Marcus like a lead blanket. As a trauma surgeon, he'd learned to compartmentalize emotions and focus on immediate medical needs. But this situation was testing those boundaries. He found himself looking at Sarah not just as a patient, but as a fellow veteran who'd stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than either of them had initially realized. How long do you think you have before they realize you're still alive? Marcus asked, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive during his SEAL missions. Not long. The shooting will be on police scanners, and if they have any kind of intelligence network, they'll know a woman matching my description was brought to this hospital. Sarah tried to sit up straighter, wincing at the pull of her sutures. I need to get out of here, but I also need time to figure out my next move. Marcus stood and moved to the window, checking the parking lot below with the automatic awareness of someone trained to spot surveillance. Everything looked normal. Typical hospital traffic, morning shift changes, families visiting patients. But normal could be deceiving when you were dealing with people trained in covert operations. What do you know about the people who want you dead? He asked, still scanning the area below. Enough to know they're professionals. The shot placement wasn't amateur. If I hadn't moved when I did, it would have been center mass and immediately fatal. They also knew exactly where to find me, which means they'd been tracking my movements. Sarah's analytical tone couldn't quite hide the underlying fear. My contact mentioned that some of the people involved had connections to private military contractors. Basically, they have access to resources that make this a very uneven fight. Marcus turned back to face her, his expression grim. Sarah, I have to ask, what exactly are you planning to do? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're vastly outgunned and running out of options. The question hit home harder than Marcus had intended. Sarah's composed facade finally cracked completely, revealing the exhaustion and desperation she'd been hiding. Honestly, I don't know. My contact was my only lead, and with him dead and the evidence missing, I'm not even sure what I'm fighting for anymore. But you can't just disappear and hope they give up. People like this don't give up. Even if I had nothing, they can't risk the possibility that I know something or that I might start asking the wrong questions. Sarah's voice carried the bitter wisdom of someone who'd seen how far powerful people would go to protect their secrets. The moment my name got connected to this, I became a loose end that needs to be tied up. Marcus paced the small room, his medical training warring with his military instincts. Every fiber of his being told him to help her, but he also had responsibilities to the hospital, to other patients, to the life he'd built since leaving the Navy. Getting involved in something like this could destroy everything he'd worked for. There might be another option, he said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. I have a friend from my SEAL days who works in cybersecurity now. Former intelligence completely trustworthy. If anyone would know how to safely approach the right authorities with this kind of information, it would be him. Sarah studied his face carefully. Why would you do that? Why would you risk getting involved in something that could get you killed? The question forced Marcus to examine his own motivations. Was it just professional duty to a patient? Fellow veteran loyalty? Or something deeper? The recognition that sometimes good people had to take risks to prevent greater harm? Because leaving you to handle this alone is essentially a death sentence. And I didn't spend 8 years serving my country just to stand by and watch innocent people get murdered by the same system I swore to protect. Marcus's voice carried a conviction that surprised even him. Besides, if what you're suggesting is true, if there's evidence of war crimes or criminal conspiracy involving high-ranking military officials, then this is bigger than just your survival. Before Sarah could respond, a soft knock interrupted them. Marcus tensed but relaxed when he saw it was just Jennifer, one of the night nurses he'd worked with for years. Dr. Webb? There are 2 men in suits asking questions at the nurses' station about the gunshot victim from last night. They're showing some kind of federal identification, but they're not being very specific about which agency. Jennifer's voice carried a note of concern that immediately put Marcus on high alert. Sarah's face went pale, confirming Marcus's worst fears. Federal agents asking questions this quickly meant that whoever was behind this had significant resources and wasn't wasting time. Did they ask to speak with me directly? She asked. Not yet, but they're asking detailed questions about your condition, when you might be released, that kind of thing. Jennifer looked between Marcus and Sarah, clearly sensing the tension in the room. Is everything okay? Marcus made a split-second decision that would change everything. Jennifer, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask questions about it. Can you arrange for Ms. Mitchell to be transferred to a different room, preferably on a different floor? Tell anyone who asks that she's being moved for additional testing. Jennifer hesitated, clearly confused by the unusual request, but her trust in Marcus's judgment won out. I can arrange that. Give me 10 minutes. After Jennifer left, Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm with surprising strength. You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. These people don't just threaten, they follow through. If you help me, you become a target too. Marcus met her eyes with steady resolve. Sarah, I've been shot at by professionals before. The difference is this time I know why I'm fighting. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling my friend. His name is David Chen, former naval intelligence. If anyone can help us navigate this situation safely, it's him. As Marcus dialed the number, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her contact first reached out 6 months ago. Hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't facing it alone. But even as relief washed over her, a darker thought nagged at the back of her mind. In her experience, hope was often the most dangerous emotion of all, especially when powerful people were determined to ensure you didn't live to see another day. David Chen answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the crisp alertness of someone accustomed to unexpected calls at unusual hours. Marcus, it's been 2 years since we last talked? This better be important if you're calling at 6 in the morning. Dave, I need your help with something sensitive. Are you on a secure line? Marcus kept his voice low, acutely aware that hospital walls weren't known for their soundproofing. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of movement. Give me 30 seconds. Marcus heard a door close, then David's voice returned, more serious now. Okay, I'm in my home office. What's going on? Marcus quickly outlined the situation, keeping the details factual and concise. David listened without interruption, his intelligence training evident in the way he absorbed information without asking for clarification until Marcus finished. Jesus, Marcus. You're talking about potential assassination attempts, military cover-ups, and federal agents who may or may not be legitimate. This is way beyond medical ethics territory. David's voice carried a mixture of concern and professional assessment. What exactly are you asking me to do? I need to know how to get this information to people who can act on it without getting Sarah killed in the process. And I need to know if those federal agents downstairs are legitimate or if they're part of whatever conspiracy she's stumbled into. Sarah, who had been listening intently, gestured for the phone. Marcus hesitated, then handed it over. Mr. Chen? This is Sarah Mitchell. I think you need to hear something that might change your perspective on this situation. Go ahead. Lieutenant, David replied, his use of her rank indicating he was already taking her seriously. 6 months ago, I was contacted by Staff Sergeant Tommy Kowalski, who served with me in Afghanistan. Tommy told me he'd discovered evidence that our unit was deliberately sent into an ambush in 2019. According to him, someone in command knew the intelligence was compromised but sent us anyway because our mission was being used to cover a black operations extraction in the same area. David was quiet for several seconds, processing the implications. How many casualties? 7 KIA, 12 wounded, including myself. We were told it was bad intelligence, enemy movement we couldn't have predicted, but Tommy claimed he had proof that the intelligence failure was intentional. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the emotional cost of reliving the memory. What kind of proof? Communications intercepts, mission briefings, evidence that the real objective was never what we were told. According to Tommy, the brass needed a distraction while they extracted someone or something from a nearby compound. We were the expendable distraction. Marcus felt his stomach clench as the full picture became clear. Military units sacrificed to cover black operations. Evidence of war crimes potentially reaching into the highest levels of command. Whistleblowers being systematically eliminated. This was the kind of conspiracy that movies were made about. Except Sarah was living it in real time. And now Tommy's dead. David stated rather than asked. Shot twice in the head before I arrived for our meeting. Professional work, no witnesses, no evidence left behind except what whoever killed him wanted to be found. Sarah's clinical description couldn't hide the fact that she'd lost someone who might have been her only path to justice. Sarah, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you have any evidence of this conspiracy? Or are you operating solely on Tommy's word? Sarah hesitated, and Marcus could see her weighing how much to reveal. Tommy gave me something 3 weeks ago. Said it was insurance in case something happened to him. I haven't looked at it because he told me it was dangerous just to possess. It's hidden somewhere safe but not somewhere I can get to easily. What kind of something? A memory card. He said it contained copies of the original mission briefings, intercepts showing command knew about the ambush, and recordings of conversations between high-ranking officers discussing the real objectives. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He also said it contained evidence of similar operations, other units that were sacrificed for political or strategic objectives. The line went silent for nearly a minute as David processed this information. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly how dangerous this situation had become. Sarah, if what you're describing is real, we're talking about potential charges of murder, conspiracy, treason, and war crimes that could reach into the Pentagon itself. The people involved wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened to expose them. David paused. But we're also talking about justice for soldiers who died believing they were serving their country, not being sacrificed for political convenience. Marcus watched Sarah's face as David spoke, seeing hope and determination warring with fear and exhaustion. What do you recommend? She asked. First, we need to get you somewhere safe while we figure out if those federal agents are legitimate investigators or cleanup crew. Second, we need to retrieve that memory card and get it to people who can verify its contents and act on them appropriately. David's voice took on the planning tone Marcus remembered from their military days. And third, we need to do all of this without getting anyone else killed. David, Marcus interjected, how do we know who to trust? If this conspiracy is as widespread as Sarah suggests, there could be compromised people in any agency we approach. That's the million-dollar question. But I have some contacts in the Inspector General's office and the Department of Justice who specialize in military corruption cases. People I've worked with before, people I trust. David was quiet for a moment. The real question is whether Sarah is willing to go through with this, knowing that once we start, there's no turning back. Sarah looked at Marcus, then spoke into the phone with a resolve that reminded him why Special Forces soldiers were considered the elite. Mr. Chen, 22 soldiers from my unit came home in body bags or missing limbs because someone decided their lives were acceptable collateral damage. If I have a chance to get justice for them, then yes, I'm willing to see this through. Then we better get started, David replied. Because if those agents downstairs are who I think they are, we're already running out of time. Jennifer returned exactly 10 minutes later with a wheelchair and a determined expression. Room 314 is ready. I told the charge nurse that Ms. Mitchell needs additional imaging studies that require special equipment on the third floor. That should buy you some time, but I can't hold off questions indefinitely. As they prepared to move Sarah, Marcus felt the weight of commitment settling on his shoulders. He was officially crossing a line from concerned physician to active participant in something that could destroy his career or worse. But looking at Sarah's determined face, he knew he'd made the right choice. The transfer went smoothly, with Jennifer expertly navigating the hospital corridors to avoid the main elevators where the federal agents were likely stationed. Room 314 was in the older wing of the hospital, with fewer security cameras and multiple exit routes, details that Marcus's military training had automatically cataloged. Once Sarah was settled, Marcus used the room's landline to call David back. "We're secure for now. What's our next move?" "I've been making some calls. The good news is that I have a contact in the DOJ who's willing to meet, but only if we can provide some preliminary evidence that this isn't just conspiracy theories." David's voice carried a note of urgency. "The bad news is that those federal agents at the hospital aren't from any agency my contacts recognize. Their credentials might be fake." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. Fake federal agents meant that whoever was behind this had resources that extended far beyond normal law enforcement capabilities. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "Unknown, but probably not long. If they're systematic about this, they'll search every room until they find you. We need to get you out of there and to the location where you hid Tommy's evidence." "That's going to be complicated," Sarah admitted. "It's hidden in my apartment, which is almost certainly under surveillance by now. Going back there would be walking into a trap." Marcus had been thinking about this problem while they talked. "What if we don't go back there directly? I know people in the hospital security department who could help create a diversion. And I have access to the hospital service tunnels. They connect to the subway system through the old pneumatic tube network." "That could work," David said, having overheard Marcus's suggestion. "But we'd need to be smart about timing. And Sarah, you're going to need help retrieving that memory card. You're in no condition to be crawling around apartments avoiding surveillance." Sarah started to protest, but Marcus cut her off. "He's right. You lost a significant amount of blood. You have fresh surgical wounds, and you're running on adrenaline and determination. That's not sustainable for complex operations." "So what are you suggesting?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew where this was heading. "I'm suggesting that I go with you," Marcus said simply. "I know this city. I have resources here, and frankly, you need backup." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Besides, I'm already in this too deep to back out now." David's voice came through the phone with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Marcus, you realize what you're volunteering for? These people have already committed multiple murders to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to add 2 more names to the list." "I know," Marcus replied, surprised by his own certainty. "But sometimes you have to take a stand, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah's unit died because someone decided their lives were expendable. I won't let their sacrifice be meaningless." Sarah studied Marcus's face, seeing something that reminded her of the best officers she'd served under. People who understood that leadership meant being willing to share the risks you asked others to take. "Okay," she said finally. "But we do this smart. No unnecessary risks, no heroics, and if this goes sideways, you get out and let me handle the consequences." "Agreed," Marcus lied smoothly, knowing that if things went wrong, he had no intention of abandoning her. David's voice interrupted their moment of understanding. "I hate to break up this touching display of military solidarity, but we have a problem. I just got word from my hospital contact that those fake federal agents are asking security to search patient rooms on the 2nd floor. They're working their way up systematically." "How much time do we have?" Marcus asked, already moving toward the room's supply closet where he'd noticed maintenance coveralls during his earlier security assessment. "Maybe 30 minutes before they reach the 3rd floor. After that, all bets are off." David paused. "There's something else. I ran facial recognition on the descriptions you gave me of these agents. One of them matches a known operative for Blackwater subsidiaries. These aren't just hired killers, they're professional contractors with government connections." The implications hit both Marcus and Sarah simultaneously. If private military contractors were involved, it meant the conspiracy had resources that extended into the corporate world as well as the military hierarchy. The web of people who wanted them dead was larger and more powerful than they'd imagined. "Then we better move fast," Sarah said. accepting the civilian clothes Marcus had found for her. Because if Tommy was right about the scope of this conspiracy, staying ahead of them is going to be the only thing keeping us alive. As Marcus helped Sarah into the maintenance coveralls, he caught a glimpse of the determination in her eyes that had probably kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. It was the look of someone who'd decided that some things were worth dying for, but was planning to live long enough to see justice done. "Sarah," he said quietly, "for what it's worth, I think Tommy chose the right person to trust with this." She met his eyes with a slight smile that carried more warmth than he'd seen from her since she'd arrived bleeding on his trauma table. "Ask me again when this is over, Doc. Assuming we both live long enough to see how it ends." The hospital's service tunnels were exactly as Marcus remembered them from his orientation years ago. A maze of pipes, electrical conduits, and maintenance walkways that most staff had forgotten existed. Sarah moved carefully beside him, her military training evident in how she navigated the cramped space despite her injuries. They emerged through a subway maintenance entrance 6 blocks from the hospital, blending into the early morning commuter crowd, with the practiced ease of people trained in urban camouflage. David had arranged to meet them at a coffee shop near Sarah's apartment, where he could provide real-time intelligence about surveillance in the area. 2 unmarked vans, 4 men in civilian clothes with obvious concealed carry, David reported quietly as they slid into a corner booth. "They're trying to look casual, but they're positioned to cover all entrances to your building. Professional setup." Sarah studied the street through the coffee shop window, her trained eye picking out the surveillance team that David had identified. "Standard box formation. They're expecting me to come back eventually, but they're not actively searching yet. That gives us an advantage." "What kind of advantage?" Marcus asked, still adjusting to the reality of planning what was essentially a covert operation in downtown Chicago. "They're watching for Sarah Mitchell, former Army medic, probably injured and on foot," David explained. "They're not watching for a hospital maintenance crew responding to a reported gas leak in the building's basement." Marcus's eyebrows rose as he understood the plan. "The hospital has emergency response agreements with the city utilities. I can request a gas leak inspection that would give us legitimate access to the building's service areas." "Exactly. And building schematics show that your apartment's bathroom shares a wall with the main utility chase," Sarah added, having clearly thought through multiple contingencies for retrieving the hidden evidence. "I can access my hiding spot from the adjacent unit's utility room without ever entering my actual apartment." David nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking, but we need to move fast. My DOJ contact can only meet with us tonight, and after that she's flying to Washington for a Senate briefing. If we miss this window, we might not get another chance." As they finalized their plan, Marcus felt the surreal nature of the situation settling over him. 12 hours ago, his biggest concern had been a difficult surgical case. Now he was planning to infiltrate a building under surveillance by professional killers to retrieve evidence of a military conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "are you sure about this? Once we retrieve that memory card, there's no going back. These people will never stop hunting us." Marcus thought about the soldiers who died in that Afghan ambush, sacrificed for political convenience by people who'd never faced enemy fire themselves. "Sarah, my oath as a doctor is to do no harm. But sometimes preventing greater harm requires taking risks. And if we don't make it out, then at least Tommy's evidence has a chance of reaching the right people through David's contacts." Marcus met her eyes with steady resolve. "Sometimes the mission matters more than the individual." David finished his coffee and stood. "Time to go. I've arranged for the gas leak report to be filed in 20 minutes. That gives you a narrow window to get in and out before those surveillance teams realize what's happening." The next hour unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Marcus's hospital credentials provided legitimate access to the building's utility systems, while Sarah's knowledge of the apartment's layout allowed them to navigate directly to the hidden memory card without detection. The evidence was exactly where Tommy had told her it would be, sealed in waterproof packaging and hidden inside a false panel behind the water heater. As they prepared to leave, Sarah paused, looking at the small device that contained evidence of her unit's betrayal. "Tommy died for this," she said quietly. 7 good soldiers died because someone decided their lives were acceptable losses. Then let's make sure their deaths weren't meaningless, Marcus replied, understanding that they were carrying more than just evidence. They were carrying the responsibility for justice that had been denied too long. The meeting with David's DOJ contact went better than any of them had dared hope. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Martinez was a former military prosecutor who specialized in corruption cases, and she recognized the significance of Tommy's evidence immediately. The memory card contained not just proof of the Afghan operation, but documentation of similar incidents dating back several years. This is enough to bring charges against at least a dozen high-ranking officials, Martinez explained as she reviewed the files. But it's also enough to get all of you killed if the wrong people find out you've come forward. What kind of protection can you offer? David asked. Witness protection for Sarah and probably for Dr. Webb as well, given his involvement. But it means disappearing completely. New identities, new lives, no contact with anyone from your past. Martinez's expression was sympathetic but firm. This isn't a temporary arrangement. These people have long memories and longer reach. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances, both understanding what this choice meant. Everything they'd built, everyone they'd known, all of it would have to be left behind. But as Marcus looked at the evidence spread across the table, proof of corruption that had cost soldiers' lives, he knew there was really no choice at all. When do we start? Sarah asked, her voice carrying the same determination that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments and 1 assassination attempt. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell and Marcus Webb officially died in a car accident outside Chicago. In reality, they began new lives in a small town in Oregon, where a former Special Forces medic worked as a paramedic and a former Navy SEAL practiced family medicine. The trials resulting from Tommy's evidence would eventually send 12 military officials to prison and expose a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon. Sometimes, justice required sacrifice, and sometimes the greatest victory was simply surviving long enough to see the truth revealed. In the quiet moments of their new life, Sarah and Marcus knew that Tommy Kowalski and the soldiers who died in that Afghan ambush had finally received the justice they deserved, even if it came at the cost of everything they'd once been. The price of truth was often higher than anyone wanted to pay, but some debts could only be settled with complete commitment to seeing justice done, regardless of personal cost.